Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Simon Copland, and I'm the Executive Director at the Conservation Council ACT region, and welcome to tonight's webinar. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on First Nations land. I suspect we might be meeting on different lands across the country. I know that certainly there's people representing a range of different lands here. So I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any First Nations person who is attending the event tonight. I think it's always interesting to think about how our issues intersect with First Nations justice, and particularly relevant in this conversation as we know that one of the things that was being negotiated in the federal environmental nature positive laws last week, or 4 weeks, was greater in responsibility engagement for First Nation people in our environmental processes. And that is obviously not happening at this point of time. And so this has a direct this issue has a direct relationship to First Nation justice that has unfortunately been defeated or delayed in the last couple of weeks due to the interests of the mining lobby, and I'm sure Erin might be able to tell you a bit more about that. So tonight we are here to talk about nature laws, and both federally and in the ACT, we are going through review processes of nature laws, and trying to get better nature legislation to protect the places that we love. And what we wanted to do tonight is bring everybody together to talk about these two processes and to talk about what's going on, where we're up to, and how you might be able to get involved. So there's two of us speaking tonight. First, there'll be Erin Farley, who is the National Advocacy Coordinator, did you say? I've just forgotten, I asked you before. Something along these lines.
Close enough.
For BirdLife Australia, and is also one of the key coordinators of the Places You Love Alliance, which has been doing a lot of the lobbying work on federal changes to the EPBC or nature laws, and been engaged very heavily in the the debates around nature positive legislation over this year. And then myself will be here to talk about the ACT nature law process, and the review of the Nature Conservation Act. So what we're going to do is we'll have short presentations from the two of us, and then from there we'll open up the room for chats, conversations, questions, discussion. We'll do the two presentations one after the other because they're definitely linked, and then we can open up the floor. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Erin, and let you share your screen, and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon. And thanks so much, everyone, for having me tonight. I'm calling from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. And I also pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the vast debt of traditional ecological knowledge and conservation that First Nation peoples have implemented and, been the custodians of in Australia. And I attended a really amazing briefing by the first People's Assembly today on treaty in Victoria. And I just want to acknowledge that that's also an ongoing and really important process in Victoria. And, there's a strong need, given sovereignty was never ceded, for that sovereign to sovereign negotiation processes to result in outcomes for First Nations people. So as Simon mentioned, I think my title, it's changed recently. I think it's Senior Advocacy Manager, something like that, for BirdLife Australia. So I'm going to do a quick presentation. I won't be able to see people raising their hand, so I'll run through it, and if you have questions, perhaps we can kind of come to them at the end. So I'll just share my screen now. Before I get started as well, I just want to so are you guys you're seeing that one? And if I go to the slideshow, I also just want to acknowledge and make clear at the outset, I'm not a bird expert, and I can see I've seen a few familiar names pop up in the list here, including the legendary Marg Blakers, who I know is a bird expert. So I just want to acknowledge that there's BirdLife is a science-based organisation of bird enthusiasts and bird experts, and our involvement in this is really based on science and the work of people like Marg and others who I'm sure are amazing bird experts. So fixing our nature laws. So first of all, and apologies again if this is if I cover anything that folks already know, I'll try and go through it pretty quickly and then we can come back to any questions. But what is it that we're talking about? So it's the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So this is Howard government legislation. It's been around for a long time, and it's not been updated in any kind of comprehensive way since it was first enacted back in 1999. So that's a very long time. It was the first set of federal national nature laws, but it did do a number of important things, but it does also require significant reform in order to do what it says on the tin, which is to protect and conserve nature. So what are the kind of two main functions of those national nature laws? So the EPBC Act is the piece of legislation at a federal level that enables the assessment of activities that might impact national environmental values, and there's a number of particular definitions and aspects of environmental values that it's based on, but that's the main kind of first element. And it also sets out the process for conservation planning, including setting listing threatened species and ecological community listings. The first one, I guess, is the most important one for the purposes of our chat tonight, in that it's not functioning as a protection and conservation act. It functions as an approvals act, an approvals and an assessment and approvals act. So it really just looks at how can we approve different projects that will have an environmental impact, and very few projects are ever knocked back. So when I talk about when I use the royal we, who am I referring to tonight? So Simon mentioned the Places You Love Alliance. So the Places You Love Alliance has been going, I think, nearly for a decade now, mostly with a focus on EPBC reform. And there are now, I think, 80 odd groups that are part of the alliance. There's a steering group made up of some of the, I guess, key nature conservation advocacy groups in the country, including BirdLife, ACF, Wilderness Society, WWF, the Marine Conservation Society, and we also get legal advice from the Environmental Defenders Office, and the Environmental Justice Australia is also part of the Places You Love Alliance. But there's a lot of incredible work that's delivered in different parts of the country by various groups, and the conservation councils are also a really important element of the alliance. So what's our problem? So I mentioned before, basically the laws aren't working the way they need to. Some examples of what is able to happen under the EPBC Act. We have habitat for the swift parrot, which is one of the most critically endangered birds in the country. There's now less than 500 of them left, essentially, and their habitat is being legally cleared in New South Wales and Tasmania, really importantly, where their breeding habitat is, because of the regional forest agreements that have a carve out under EPBC legislation. There's also a whole lot of habitat destruction that just never gets even referred. So that means the Act never even has a bearing on that habitat destruction. That's a lot of that is legal land clearing that happens under things like bushfire so-called bushfire management by government agencies, but also by agriculture in places like Queensland. And there are high levels of ministerial discretion that enable decisions to be made that just green light environmental destruction because of political or lobby influence that's been brought to bear on the minister who has jurisdiction over the Act, which is the Environment Minister. So that slide mentions Toondah Harbour, which was an area of Ramsar wetland that was threatened by real estate development that has actually been knocked back because the Environment Minister signalled that she would not be approving it, and the proponent withdrew. But if the EPBC Act remains unreformed, they can just bring that proposal back again. And if they think they'll get a better go under a different minister, they possibly will be able to succeed. So we need to be preventing extinctions and recovering wildlife, not just assessing projects that damage habitat. We need standards that are going to facilitate that protection and restoration. We need better independent oversight of how those rules and protections are enforced. And we need to improve accountability and public trust in the Act. The community has very little ability to, most of the community ability to influence decisions comes from political pressure rather than, for example, being able to push for a review of decisions based on, the merits of the decisions that have been made. So that's another really key element. So there are statutory reviews of the EPBC Act need to happen every 10 years, and the last one was the Samuel Review. So that was actually 5 years ago now. So it's been 5 years since Professor Graham Samuel reviewed the Act and came up with a number of recommendations to improve it. And it's the legislative implementation of those recommendations that led to, what has been happening in Parliament most recently. So what has happened since the Samuel Review? So there was the Professor Graham Samuel did a very big, thorough review. There was a lot of consultation as part of that review. The general public could put in submissions. There was a lot of detailed roundtable consultation with other stakeholders, environment groups, but also with business, with farming, with First Nations, and that came up with what really was already a compromise set of recommendations that were, whilst they weren't perfect, they were a really big step forward compared with what the EPBC Act is able to do at the moment. That review happened under the previous coalition federal government, and the Labor Party was elected saying that they would respond to the Samuel Review and with a couple of different commitments around that. So they came out with their nature positive plan, which was their the Albanese government's response to the Samuel Review that outlined, a number of, pretty good commitments. Again, not perfect, but saying they were going to do a whole bunch of things, including an EPA, and to prevent, they committed to no new extinctions. And then there was a big, long consultation process on the development of legislation. A nature repair market was legislated in December of 2023, and then draft legislation around a couple of other different elements that I'll come to shortly was put to Parliament this year in April. So the kind of key elements that we want to see happen, and what the government actually said they were going to do, and where we've gotten to. So the government committed to no new extinctions. And they did release a threatened species action plan that had some funding and some, commitments, but they haven't yet proposed how they're going to do that with legally binding and effective recovery plans. So currently under the EPBC Act, a recovery plan is one of the most effective ways to protect species because the Environment Minister has a legal obligation not to act in contravention with a recovery plan. That's why there's not that many recovery plans, and a lot of them have got very vague language in them. But if they were used properly, they would be a very powerful tool. We want robust rules and standards to protect and restore nature. So national environmental standards were a real centerpiece of what Graham Samuel proposed. And essentially, these would set in place baselines that would not only ensure that decisions couldn't be made in a way that would threaten species, but also help to kickstart the restoration of nature, which is what we need. We need to stop going backwards, but we also need to start restoring nature. Environment groups have done a lot of work around what those standards might look like, but unfortunately, they really haven't gone anywhere in terms of being legislated, which we'll come to next. Building an agency that has the grit to apply and enforce the rules. So establishing a new agency to oversee environmental decision-making was one of the clearest commitments that, the federal government made. And they have proposed a bill which is still before the Senate. So this was a good step forward, but the bill that they actually introduced was really very weak. It still included carve-outs that retained that ministerial discretion, including, importantly, not having an independent board. So really, essentially, all you had was a National Environment Protection Authority that would oversee compliance. So that means when proponents, so someone wants to build a mine and the minister says, yes, okay, you can build this mine, but you have to meet the following conditions, such as doing restoration activities or, making sure you don't undertake activities in a particular area or a time of year to reduce impact on species. That agency would be responsible for making sure that proponents complied with those conditions. Because at the moment, a lot of the time, compliance is not monitored and it's very weak. And you can kind of see that again and again with, how companies will leave a site after they've mined an area, for example. So that was one of the big things that environment groups were pushing for was a stronger EPA that would have more independence in order to, protect decision-making from political influence. And then the other thing that we are looking for is improved accountability and public trust. So the government proposed to establish a new statutory office known as Environmental Information Australia. So this was basically one of the most uncontroversial aspects of what Samuel proposed and really didn't have any opposition from business or mining, and environment groups, including BirdLife, are very supportive of it. However, the functions of better managing and using environmental data, a new office would be useful, but a lot of those functions do already exist in the department. They just need to be better coordinated and funded. One of the key things, though, was that the establishment of Environmental Information Australia. So the proposal was that they would be responsible for delivering the state of environment reports and also establishing baselines and, really importantly, establishing what the definition of nature positive is, because this definition would be essentially guide whether or not the Act was doing what it was supposed to be doing. The definition that was proposed in the bill that was put to Parliament recently was quite weak and needed a lot more work. So a lot more was needed. And so these bills were put to Parliament in April this year. They were welcomed as a step forward, but obviously the substantive elements of what Professor Samuel proposed were missing. And there was a really concerted push from Green groups and others to get more from these, to strengthen the existing bills and to try and get more out of their passage, as well as not losing momentum for the rest of what needed to be delivered based on Samuel's recommendations. The framing the government was using was to call these two bills Tranche 2. So they called the Nature Repair Market Tranche 1. The EPA and Environmental Information Australia bills were Tranche 2. And then there was to be a further Tranche 3 that would have delivered the National Environment Standards and other elements. There were really strong calls for some outcomes from the bills that they put in April, particularly on climate. So a push to get what's known as a climate trigger, which would essentially mean that the minister would have to consider climate impacts, or like create a trigger to ensure that the minister had to consider potential climate impacts when approving fossil fuel projects, and also to get an immediate outcome on the protection of forests. So really trying to look at how to deal with RFAs. So that was where we were at. And I should say that was the result of a lot of years of campaigning and work and a lot of inside track kind of input and meetings and stuff, even just to get the government to go that far. But what we saw was that the opponents to nature law reform really pushed back in a way that we have seen them do in the past. And the strongest opposition was very much from the mining sector lobby, and particularly operating in Western Australia. So you saw the Nightly, which is the media outlet that is funded by Gina Rinehart, running regular articles, against the government. Their mining lobby were all over Parliament House regularly. And they also exerted their influence via the West Australian Premier Roger Cook. And unfortunately, what we saw was that influence and I guess direction of the mining sector lobby prevailing most recently. So we were really hoping that these bills, which had been, they were passed through the lower house earlier this year. There was some really strong work pushing amendments by the crossbench in the lower house, which didn't succeed, obviously, because they don't have the numbers, but some really good amendments proposed to set things up well for the Senate. And then the bills were before the Senate, and some really, and there was a great deal of willingness by, we know, the Greens and the Senate crossbench to negotiate with the government in order to see something pass that would be acceptable. Unfortunately, what we saw was the Prime Minister intervened, and there's been quite a lot of media coverage that, negotiations were actually quite close, and the Prime Minister intervened and, kind of came in over the top of the Environment Minister, and any kind of possibility of an outcome was taken off the table for passage in this, this year before the end of the sitting weeks in 2024. So where are we at now? The bills are still on the notice paper, and there's still rumors and discussion, and I've kind of put there a story just from last night that Environment Minister is still, looking to negotiate something. It it's possible, although it does feel, still fairly unlikely that there might, can still be an outcome given the West Australian election is coming up in March, and there's probably only going to be 2 more sitting weeks in February before the budget sitting week, and then we'll be in an election period. So it's possible, but doesn't look likely. And where we're at is that nature still desperately needs reform to our national laws in order to create stronger protections and, enable the community to stand up and have a stronger voice. So where does that leave us? The government definitely has unfinished business. They have not delivered, some of their key commitments that they've made in this term of government on this reform, and MPs will be under pressure from voters. I had a chat to Simon at the end of last week because I was like, geez, I'm just not sure how I'm going to go in this webinar, because I was feeling pretty flat after what had happened. But some of the coverage has been, I guess, buoying in some ways, because we know that a lot of the pressure that has been put on the backbench by people like yourselves across the country has had an effect, and there will be MPs that we think are concerned about the failure of the government to deliver on this reform. Where we're at is we really got to be looking to the election and how we continue to put them under pressure, whilst still, I guess, not letting up in case we can't, there is the possibility of seeing an outcome next February. So that's kind of where we're at. I think obviously there is a lot of other opportunities to seek nature protections that are separate to the EPBC Act, but it is still really quite fundamental, I guess, in terms of how major projects in Australia occur, and I think it's going to remain a key issue for the environment movement for, until we get those changes. I'll stop sharing.
Right, thank you so much, Erin. We'll leave questions and comments until after my presentation. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen now and get going to talk about the ACT situation. And can you all see that? Erin, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see it?
Yeah.
Right. It's always hard when you can't see it on your own screen to know that everybody else can see it. Okay, so thank you, Erin, for that really good summary of what's happening federally. So I want to talk about what's happening in the ACT, because obviously we have both federal and state/territory environmental legislation, and the ACT's key environmental law, the Nature Conservation Act, is actually up for review right now. So we're going through 2 dual processes in which federal and ACT laws are under review, and the Conservation Council is engaging in this ACT review very strongly and wanted to provide a briefing on that. So first of all, I think it's really important to say that Canberra's nature is facing significant threats, particularly on the edges of the city. We have, I think, a reputation in the ACT as being a very environmentally friendly place, which in many ways we are. We are one of the leaders in climate action here. But the sprawl and spread of the ACT is leading to the destruction of natural places and the ongoing fights from community to protect those places. So here's a few photos and links of things that have been happening. So I think many people here would know about Blewett's Block, which is a key piece of ecosystem that has been under threat for quite some time. It's only recently just been declared that they intend to turn that parts of that block into a nature reserve. but already development has been happening on other parts of that block, destroying some of our key ecosystems, and that is going to have an impact on the broader block itself. We've seen the first wild koala sighting in Canberra's north recently, which has been sighted on a block that is slated for development, for housing development. And we're waiting for the outcomes of that to see whether that will have an impact on that development or whether that will still go ahead despite this endangered species being sighted in the north of Canberra, which is quite a big news story for Canberra, given we don't really see koalas here. There's small pieces of land, the ANZ volcanic site, which is an area that conservationists and volunteers have been regenerating, a grassland site, a threatened ecosystem there that have been regenerated, that is being regenerated through volunteers, but there's just been a recent decision, approval to put a communications tower on that block, on that land, which will have an impact on that work. And on the right there is the potential plan for development of the Western Edge. This is a plan that goes back many years now, but the Western Edge is a huge area of land that goes from the south of Belconnen all the way down to Tuggeranong, a very important box garden woodland and grassland area where the government is still investigating its potential to be developed for housing, a huge amount of housing, and if so, would have significant environmental impacts that we really want to be avoiding and that we would oppose. So I want to just frame this, that we have this beautiful environment in the ACT, but we are facing consistent threats and pressures. And part of the reason for that is that our environmental legislation in the ACT is not working. So what is the Nature Conservation Act? The Nature Conservation Act is the ACT's premier environmental legislation, but it's failing, similar to federal laws. And one of these ones that sort of sits under the radar, I think, in many ways, but is facing, is a serious issue. More species are being added to our endangered species list, while the government's just continue to destroy ecosystems to expand our city. And since the 2020 election, for example, 5 species have been added to the ACT's threatened species list, including the Gang-Gang Cockatoo, which was added nationally, but of course that has an impact on the ACT. And that is something that, it's our bird emblem, an iconic part of the Canberra nature. And it's really sad to see that being added to the threatened species list. And it's something that we should be reflecting on about, what's happening with our environmental protection in the ACT, that these animals keep being added to the list. So what have we done? So what's the problem with the Nature Conservation Act? So the legislation is really about protection of natural areas and particularly nature reserves in the ACT. And we have found, so there was a discussion paper that was put out about halfway through this year, and our biodiversity working group did quite a lot of work to develop a submission to that discussion paper, doing a lot of examination of the Act. And it found that the Nature Conservation Act fails to protect, conserve, and enhance biodiversity in the ACT, and it does so for a number of reasons. First, on the top left there, the Act focuses on individual species rather than landscapes, resulting in fragmentation of critical habitats. So very focused on protection of threatened species, which is of course very important. But when you don't take that ecosystem-wide view, what often happens is that there is a specific focus on threatened species, but it doesn't look at the ecosystems that support those species, which can often lead to fragmentation of habitat because areas get broken up through development, areas get broken up through further development, which can have a real impact. So it's not looking at Canberra as a whole; it's looking at the specific species, and then that can lead to fragmentation of our biodiversity. Similar to the federal laws, climate change is not considered as a key threat to our nature, and in many ways, this is just an area where things need to be updated. And that is a really important part of this, is that we need to be considering climate change as a key threat and incorporating it into our nature laws. The legislation often lacks primacy over other legislation in nature reserves, which can have an impact on the ability to enforce issues that are happening in reserves. And then enforcement and measures to promote compliance are often insufficient, including a lack of clearly defined indicators for assessing the efficacy of conservation strategies. And one of the things is that also that enforcement, the fines, for example, are just far too low. And so when people are destroying particularly nature reserves, when there's poor management or when builders or developers destroy that, the fines are just too low to really discourage that. There's a lack of legal requirements for measuring and reporting on biodiversity outcomes. And then the final one and the most significant one in the sort of bottom middle there is that significant powers are held by planning authorities favouring development outcomes over nature. In particular, the ACT is the only state or territory in the country where planning authorities are the ones who declare nature reserves. And this is significant. So to get a nature reserve declared, it has to go through the Territory Planning Authority. The Territory Planning Authority is obviously really thinking about how to build, how to develop our city. And so there is often a favouring of development outcomes over nature, and it requires the community to be really fighting hard to get nature reserves declared. And we saw this with the Blewitts Block declaration. Blewitts Block is the first, which we expect it will, to be declared as a nature reserve, will be one of the first nature reserves to be declared in many, many years that wasn't declared as an offset. So it wasn't declared to offset development somewhere else. It was declared because of its intrinsic value. And that suggests that there's a significant problem when it takes so much work to get nature reserves declared. And that's because we believe there are real conflicts of interest here in planning authorities are favouring development outcomes over nature, and in turn, that's halting the development of further nature reserves or further protected areas. So what are we saying needs to change, therefore? We're arguing, and you can see the alternative here is, that we've identified the problems and the changes. So we think that the new legislation should be based on an ecosystem approach to enable the government to implement an ACT-wide biodiversity network so all valuable areas, whether a national park or on the roadside, are managed well. And I want to talk about the biodiversity network in a second. Key elements of the legislation are moved away from planning authorities to the Nature Conservation Act. In particular, we're talking here about the Declaration of Nature Reserves and the Declaration of Protected Areas. List climate change as a key threat to nature. Recognise the authority of regions' First Nations people as stewards of land and include decision-making powers within the Act. We argue that decision makers must refuse developments with unacceptable impacts on threatened species or their habitat and threatened ecological communities, and that really should be put into the Nature Conservation Act, and that should have an interaction with the planning, the development process, the development application process. That there should be ways to identify what is an unacceptable impact through a development application, and then to legally require that if an assessment has been done, it shows that it has unacceptable impacts, that it must be refused. We wanted to strengthen compliance mechanisms, and what we say here is actually do some enforcement, in particular including higher penalties for dodgy developers who destroy our nature or for anybody who destroys our nature. We want to have greater powers for rangers to enforce the Act in nature reserves. We want to make the conservator of flora and fauna independent. So the conservator of flora and fauna has a major role, particularly around development applications, in requiring changes, in halting destruction of nature. But that role is not independent. They sit within the planning and environment planning directorate. And that can often, we believe, lead to them receiving multiple pressures from different avenues. Whereas if that role was independent, they would have a greater authority to sort of flex their muscles. And we want to legislate a requirement for a regular review of measurable qualitative and quantitative targets with publicly available outcomes. So that's kind of what we're looking for to see changed in the Nature Conservation Act. The other element, and we mentioned this earlier, is that we want to see the funding and the creation of a nationwide, a territory-wide biodiversity network. And this is a project that was really spearheaded by, I think Sarah's in the room here, Sarah, who's from Friends of Grasslands, and with the assistance of our biodiversity working group. And what it does, it sets out the idea of a biodiversity network. It's a proactive proposal, which is a biodiversity network to create a citywide network of biodiversity protection in reserves and on non-reserve pieces of land. And the core element here is that we have a reserve network in the ACT. That reserve network is often underfunded and many of our reserves are not well managed. But we also have other significant pieces of land, whether small or large, that maybe are not suitable to go into the reserve network, but have biodiversity benefits or have real values, biodiversity values. And what we're saying is that we should be creating a network looking at the territory, looking at the entire territory, identifying key areas of conservation, of biodiversity value, and then conserving that land, whether it's in the reserve network or not. And that might mean different land managers conserving it, or having, or at least taking into account the biodiversity values in the way they manage that land. So a really classic example of this is that the Directorate of TCCS, so Transport, Canberra and City Services, they manage a whole lot of land, whether it's parks or roadsides, these types of lands that often have significant biodiversity value. And what we're saying is that they should be brought into a biodiversity network, and that they're required to think about the biodiversity values when they're managing that land. And that's comes from a history in which they've only really thought about amenity to community, but they've not thought about biodiversity values when managing that land. We're really happy that at the moment that the language is being adopted by the government, and we've been engaged in conversations around for example, a new nature conservation strategy that's being developed, and they're adopting this language, which is really valuable, and it's something that the government is really interested in pursuing. But we think it's only a viable idea if there's a legislative framework to back it up, and if there's proper funding to back it up. We need significantly increased funding, in particular for management of land, so that it can be managed properly and regenerated properly. And that again is for reserves and non-reserve spaces. And these two things are deeply interlinked, that we need to have good legislative framework to be able to make this biodiversity network a viable approach. So what are we doing on this? So we raised the profile of this issue as a key ask for the ACT election in 2024, the one that just passed in October. We undertook media, advocated with candidates, and hosted a candidates forum. We're likely to run another community event in early 2025 when the draft legislation comes out. So just to give you a bit of background, what's happened is that there has been a discussion paper led by the government. We've put in feedback into that. And the next step is that there should be draft legislation coming out sometime early next year, and in which case we'll look and assess that legislation, see what improvements there are, and see what improvements we might need to call for further. And we'll be encouraging people to make submissions and to engage in that process, and hopefully run a community event at that point of time to really boost support for further changes. We've developed and run a petition calling for fixes to the Act, and I'll share that soon. We'll be hosting briefings for key decision makers, and I'm starting to meet with the minister, as well as with key decision makers around this legislation, to sort of brief them on the changes that we'd like to see. We're going to develop some case studies on how our current laws are failing and highlight these, do stuff on social media, and of course undertake relevant submissions and encourage others to put in submissions for a stronger law. One element of this, and I think it's really important, is to think about what the new government looks like. And there's actually some unique political opportunities here, particularly around legislation, to see significant changes. So we have a returned ALP government in the ACT, but what we have for the first time is a minority government with no minor party, with all the other minor parties sitting on the crossbench. So for the first time since 2012, the Greens are not sitting in the ministry. They are not a formal part of government, but instead are sitting on the crossbench. And of course, we have our first two independents being elected since 1998. That's Fiona Carrick in the seat of Murrumbidgee and Tom Emerson in the seat of Kurrajong. So we have a situation in which the government will be introducing this legislation. They're required to do so. It's a statutory review, so they are legally required to introduce changes. But they will at least do a review, but they will have to get agreement from either the crossbench or the Liberal Party to see changes happen. And so here we have a unique opportunity to encourage those crossbenchers or the Liberal Party to see significant changes made to strengthen our laws. And there's a unique opportunity here to do that. We of course have a new Environment Minister as well, Suzanne Orr, and I think of all of the Labor MLAs we've got, I think we'll probably have one of the better ones for our new Environment Minister. I know Suzanne is very committed to the environment, and you'll see some of the, I'm just going to go in the next slide, some of the announcements they've made, and she's made some good announcements that sort of link to these issues. And we'll also be working with other key ministers around this. Tara Shane, in particular, around city services, which is really about the biodiversity network, ensuring that land is managed in the city services portfolio, and Chris Steele around planning and heritage, and that is really talking about the role the planning system plays, and we'll be talking with Chris about why we think that that these laws should be moved away from the planning system and more to the environmental portfolio. So just a little bit on that, I think one of the things that is really valuable here is we did push for these changes as part of the ACT election. This is a key environmental announcements from the ALP, which are the ones that will obviously be implemented. There are more, but you can see the second one there is continuing to review our environmental legislation and regulatory settings. I think federal, like similar to the federal ALP, they like to talk about reviews and see where that comes, but it does suggest that they're looking at this. There are a couple of other things here that are quite valuable, for example, like increased funding provided to weed management, developing and managing an interface policy to guide best practice between urban and non-urban areas. So looking at how we can better manage our reserves and our areas of high biodiversity conservation. So there's some valuable things here. Employing additional dedicated volunteer coordinators within TCCS is also a really important part of this policy process. So these are not, the biggest and best announcements, but they give us a framework in which we can keep pushing the ALP to really be doing something stronger, both with our laws and with the implementation of them through the management of our biodiversity, high biodiversity valued areas. So a couple of things you can do to get involved, and I'll pop this in the chat, is first of all, sign the petition to really call for stronger nature laws. So I'll put that link in the chat, and that will be something that we'll be taking to government in the new year, really outlining what our key demands are. And then obviously, if you're willing to support us through a donation. We can only run these campaigns through the funding and support of people like you. And with generous support, we can really help keep the heart of environmental action in the ACT beating. And continue to push for stronger protection of the region we all call home. And we really value all of the donations we receive, and it really helps us continue this really important work. So I think that's me done. What I'll do now is thank you all for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can open up we can open up the floor for questions, any questions or comments. And we've got maybe, I think we were going to 8, so we'll see how we go. But that gives us about 40 minutes if people have questions, comments for either myself or Erin. Please pop your hand up and I'll hopefully...
Overwhelmed everybody with nature law reform discussion.
Surely someone has something.
I did see a message. I can just respond to it. Just noting Fatima Payman's the role that she played. It's not quite clear whether she was definitely not going to support the legislation or whether that's the government's kind of agenda, because we have heard some intel that that's not necessarily what the case is. But that is, obviously an issue in that she is an independent sitting on the crossbench. She's a West Australian senator. And the West Australian mining lobby would have exerted a huge amount of pressure on her. That said, we did have some good engagement with her in the lead up to over the last 6 months in terms of what's been happening in Parliament.
Can I ask, based off that, Erin, what engagement you maybe had with other members of the crossbench who weren't the so-called progressives? So Jackie Lambie, Lamb, I can always forget his first name. Those folks. I mean, I imagine Pauline Hanson was not going to be coming out supporting this, but those other folks, what was the kind of engagement like with them?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess so we did have obviously some really great engagement with ACT Senator David Pocock, and he really, has come out as a big champion for nature out of this process. In terms of some of the others, so our understanding was that they did not want to be left being, so in terms of Lambie and Tyrrell. They didn't necessarily want to end up being the ones on the hook for whether or not the legislation would pass or not. So our understanding was that there was a pathway through the Senate, that we could have it could have been passed. Senator Lydia Thorpe, also there was a lot of engagement with her. And she had some specific issues, but she was supportive of environmental protection as well. So the other less progressive crossbench senators were not shaping up to be an issue, I guess, in as a short way of responding to your question.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of things just in the comment chat. I'll just read them out. So that was the one about Fatima payment. Then Max said, in other words, the ACT Conservation Act is a complete mess, which needs to be urgently overhauled and rewritten. It's unworkable and favours property developers. Let's not beat around the bush. I mean, that's really what we're trying to get at here. So maybe we can say it more strongly. But yeah, I agree with you, Max. That's the problem. And I think then there's a comment here from Larry as well that says the biggest developer in the ACT is the ACT government, and it does not always follow guidelines or even legislation. So it's not just the act that needs change, it's actually accountability that needs to improve. However, the government does not even act on recommendations from the Auditor-General on matters relating to the Western Edge. I mean, I think there's, it's a really good comment, Larry, and one that I can just reflect on. I don't know as much about the recommendations from the Auditor-General on Western Edge. I'm getting my head around a lot of that, but we can look, for example, at the finding of the koala, the gula in the north, which is an area that is slated for the further development of the suburb of Jakarta. We believe it's about 180 houses that they want to build there, and that's where that koala has been found. And that land is owned by the Suburban Land Agency, and it is there is significant. We know that there is significant pressure to ensure that that land can still be developed. One of the things that is very clear in the ACT is the ACT government makes a lot of money off land sales or off land development. And so when the Suburban Land Agency bought that land, they're expecting to be able to sell it to developers or to homeowners to be able to get the returns on those sales. And so there's significant pressure to go around environmental concerns to ensure that land is sold so they can make money off it. And we know that this is something that's happened in the Western Edge. We don't know how much, but we believe that the Suburban Land Agency has purchased land in the Western Edge. And that means that there will be significant pressure that they'll be putting on the government, on other parts of the government, to ensure that they can sell it so they can make money off it. And they wouldn't buy it unless they thought that they could make money off it. So it's a significant concern. And it's a significant concern when you have a base of a budget that is often based in land sales, and that's the ACT. I mean, a lot of our money comes from property development, and that's a real concern, and why we're seeing this consistent pressure on the edge of the city. I saw you put your camera on, Larry. Did you have any questions or comments based on that?
There was a major report done by the Auditor General into what had actually happened with the Western Edge, and there were a couple of close to corrupt purchases of land in the Western Edge. These are farming leases, rural leases, which were obtained, and they purchased them rather than whatever it is when the government takes over. But it wasn't quite enough evidence to take anybody to court on it. So there's about 13 or 14 different rural leases out there. But what the Auditor General recommended was that there be a full audit of all of the land holdings in the ACT, and that they be looked at with relation to what should happen with them, regardless of tenure. So it didn't matter if the government bought it or not. It still had to look at it, on what was going on. Related to this was that in 04 or 02 or something like that, some ratbag backbencher called Mick Gentleman moved a motion to put all of the Western Edge into a conservation not to be developed in perpetuity. And that was supported by the Liberals as well. Everybody supported it. public servants immediately started to read that as not for 20 years. And so they are now looking at doing development out there, which means putting roads through, putting the big battery, the Neoen big battery out there for making our renewable more solid. And also the FOGO development was going to go out there too, the waste facility. So the government is not actually putting houses there yet, but it is starting the process of putting out infrastructure and so on. There'll probably be a new access road just going next to Blewett's block through to out there. It's on the maps. They're ready to go. So, you know, they've just not paid attention to what people have said in the past, and they're going forward. Now, the other thing about that, the SLA at that stage was called the Land Development Agency, and they made decisions without cabinet approval that that land was going to be developed one day. Canberra needed to get bigger, and that's where it was going to go. And so they went out and started to make decisions before cabinet had even started to think about these things. So it's what they say in the ACT. The cabinet is only a temporary advisory committee to the public service.
Thanks, Larry. I mean, that's really interesting and useful background for everybody to know. And just for everyone's information, this is something that the Conservation Council will be working on a lot more, particularly in the new year, will be the Western Edge and this suburban development. I think this is becoming a clearer and clearer, bigger issue across the city that we'll be working on. I've got some more questions here. So one, again, from Larry, this is for you, Erin. Do national standards just facilitate the transfer of decision-making to the states and territories? Isn't it best to keep environmental decisions at a national level rather than devolve into places like the ACT where the government is the biggest developer? So I guess this is about who's making decisions and what's best to do here.
Yeah, so in terms of devolution, yes, and there was a big push under the coalition government to devolve decision-making to the states, which I guess Places You Love and other groups were successfully able to stymie. The role of the national environment standards would not, I guess, necessarily transfer the decision-making to states and territories because they would still be being set at a federal level. And I think whether or not they were being met would be overseen at a federal level as well. However, that detail hasn't been worked out in legislation, and that would be something to watch for. What you might be referring to is regional planning, which was one of the other elements from Samuel's recommendations. And there were some really good opportunities, but also big risks in that regional planning approach, in that we wouldn't want to see it done in the way that what's known as strategic, the term has escaped me, but essentially approaches where essentially like a whole bunch of activities are given a big green tick once a kind of a consultation process has occurred. So we would want to see regional planning happening in a way that was really looking at how to best put aside critical habitat and I guess take the approach of looking at where fast no's would happen, so the areas that are off limits, and where more appropriate places for development of particular types is okay, but still have in place the checks and balances. So that's kind of how the regional planning approach would occur, and there would have been a regional planning standard as part of that set of national standards. I also saw, so in terms of, is it still worthwhile to lobby your federal MPs? Yes, it absolutely is. And it's that kind of political pressure on MPs and candidates as we move into the election period that is going to make all of the difference. And different groups will be continuing, providing direction and opportunities and tactics and that kind of stuff. But if they don't feel some backlash from the electorate, then we're not going to see any change. And so that's, I guess, the next step is making sure the government understands that they're not going to be let off the hook on this.
Can I make a comment on that, Erin?
Yes, please.
Just for given we're in the ACT, I think it's really, we're the ACT body, and I think most people here in the ACT, I think it's really worthwhile thinking about what that looks like in the ACT and who's best to target. And there's a couple of things that I think are a couple of MPs. I think we have 4 ALP MPs in the ACT, federal MPs, 2 ministers, who obviously Katie Gallagher and Andrew Lee. But also in the lower house with Alicia Payne and David Smith, we have 2 MPs. Alicia Payne, in particular, likes to position herself as an environmental MP. It's kind of her biggest issues, climate and the environment, things she talks about a lot. But quite frankly, often doesn't do as much as I think she could to really pushing that, both internally or externally. I'm probably being very nice in even the way I'm saying that. And I think that there is a lot of work that could be done to be pressuring Alicia Payne to be much more vocal. And Alicia is facing the second party there. That in the last election, the Greens entered second place, and so she'll be facing pressure from the Greens in the next election and the election after, most likely, which I think is really important. And then in down south, there's David Smith, who is an MP for the seat of Bean, and there's been a recent announcement of a candidate from Friends of Bean, Community Voices for Bean, and he'll be receiving, I think, quite a bit of pressure from an independent candidate. And that's an opportunity to really be pressuring him to be speaking out on issues like this, because those groups will be focused rightfully on the environment. And so there's an opportunity there as well to be really putting pressure on him around this legislation and to be getting him to speak out and to be speaking within his caucus. So we actually have some unique opportunities here in the ACT to be pressuring our Labor MPs, both the 2 ministers who have obviously quite a significant amount of influence, and Katie Gallagher is quite influential within the federal government, and then 2 backbenchers who are both facing pressures from more progressive, environmentally focused parties. And I think that both of those things could lead us to be getting them to be putting internal pressure on to get these laws passed. Erin, just to keep going. So there's another question. I've got a few more questions here. And folks, you can put your hand up and ask your question, but I'll take the ones that are on chat first. Erin, I think this is again for you. Are the environment groups putting together a seriously big budget bid for nature as part of campaigning for the March budget and the election?
Yeah, so there's the answer to that, Mark, I guess, is yes. And so a number of groups are doing that, and you probably are aware of so different groups are framing it differently. And so I don't have in front of me all of the different the ways the different groups are doing it. But for example, Pew and others are calling for 1% for nature. So that's 1% of the federal budget to be allocated towards nature protection. And that is off the back of the 30 by 30 commitment, which is a commitment that the government's made to protect 30% of Australia by 2030 to prevent native species extinctions. So this is part of Australia's global commitments under the Convention for Biodiversity kind of work that we have signed up to. And Australia did also host the Nature Positive Summit in October, although it was a bit of a fizzer in terms of a nature event globally. So I guess the answer to that is yes. In terms of the what kind of a role a funding ask is going to play in terms of the election campaigning, I think that's definitely a question that something that different groups are considering in terms of how we re-strategize after what's happened. So I should have also said that a lot of what I'm saying is, it's kind of where we're at now, but there's definitely a lot of reflecting and thinking and re-strategizing that is happening at the moment, because we do have to acknowledge that really, we had high hopes under this parliament that we would see reform happen. And yet again, we've seen, state capture by mining sector lobby kind of destroy our hopes for legislative reform. So we need to look at what are we going to do? How do we actually see change happen? And they're all still very live questions. So I guess the answer to that, Marg, is not sure yet, but it will definitely be playing a role for some groups. And there was another question.
Another question there from
in terms of the death by 1,000 cuts. So that is what the national environment standards were like. That was, I guess, one of the key issues that the national environment standards were aiming to address, because that that is one of the biggest issues, and I'm really glad. That Richard, you've pointed that out, because obviously each and every decision, is based on the significant impact of that particular decision and that particular proposal, not everything as it adds up. So that's what the national environment standards were supposed to deal with.
Thanks. Michelle, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, just thanks very much for the speakers. It's really great work. So I just have a few thoughts maybe you'd like to comment on. One is in regard to the Western Edge. David Pocock has suggested it be an Indigenous protected area. I think that's a really worthy idea. Another thing, just about the emphasis to refuse developments if they have an unacceptable impact on threatened species or endangered ecological communities. It seems to me we want to protect nature before it's endangered. And I actually think we should be protecting all natural habitat that still survives, because we've lost so much, and we really don't have any excuse to take out more natural habitat when there's so much unnatural habitat that we can use instead. And I also think it's really important, especially at the federal level, to emphasize the fact that the government has an important role to invest in nature on behalf of society. It just makes sense that the government do this, pay for it.
I can start. Thanks, Michelle. I think those are really valuable comments. Just on the Western Edge, yeah, we are definitely aware of the proposal from David Pocock for that become an Indigenous protected area. And that's something that we think is a valuable proposal. We'd be working, our goal will be to see this protected in one way or another, and this could be a really valuable way to do it. And we'd be working with all of the different stakeholders, ideally to see the best outcome. And I think moving forward, in general, protected areas should increasingly have First Nations engagement and involvement in them. And another example of this is we were talking, and this is something that became a little bit of a victim of the failed negotiations last week, that's come out that David Pocock had, as part of his negotiations for this, some in principle agreement to see two parts of the ACT, that's Stirling Park and Yarramundi Reach, which are owned by the National Capital Authority, to see those as part of his agreements to pass the nature positive bills, to see those become protected. Particularly Stirling Park is still under potential threat. It's a really important area in Yarralumla that is a boxcomb woodland and grassy woodland area, and it needs to be protected, but it's under threat because there's still sort of lingering potentials of there being a new prime ministerial lodge built there that's been on proposal since about 2012. And one of the things, so we're talking with Jamie Piddock from Friends of Grassland, one of the proposals there would be to see that handed over to traditional owners, because it's also a very culturally significant site. And I think that's something that could be quite valuable there, as another example of where Indigenous owners could play an integral role in managing our land. And so we're very supportive of that and would want to do the work to make that happen. I think that the other comment that I just wanted to reflect on was around protecting, about stopping the degradation rather than protecting nature overall. So this kind of impacts on, unacceptable impacts. And I think it's a really fair point, and it's something that we strongly agree with here in the ACT. And it's one of the purposes of the Biodiversity Network proposal is to really be doing proper mapping of what are the areas that we really need to see conserved and to make them no-go zones, and to really be looking at the ACT as a whole rather than just thinking about threatened species. The Conservation Council actually also has a policy of no new greenfield suburbs, apart from those that are sort of being developed now or under plan to be developed. And I think that that's a really important policy to be thinking about. As the population grows, how can we have proper density and gentle density to be looking at how we do infill and building places on surface car parks rather than building them on the edge of our city and destroying further nature. And I think that's a conversation we really need to be having, and there's something that we want to lead as the ACT Conservation Council to be really leading this conversation about what does what does further sustainable development look like, and how can we do that in a way that's not continuing to destroy nature, whether it's a critical area or an area that we don't want to become critical because we keep on expanding out. And if this is the risk, is that if we keep on expanding out, the species that's not threatened today might be threatened in 10 years' time, and we don't want that to happen. And so we can't just be thinking just about threatened species. We have to be thinking about the territory or the country as a whole, because otherwise you risk that, oh, well, we forgot about that species because it wasn't threatened, but in 10 years' time it becomes threatened. And then we don't want to get to that stage at all.
Good on you, Simon.
Erin, did you have any comments on any of that?
No, I think you've covered it, and I guess that's also one of the focuses of the reform that groups have been seeking is about that restoration, because it is under the current system just this constant slog to stop species from going off the edge, and then as soon as they start doing better, then they come under pressure again because the levels of protection are reduced. So I guess I disagree with all of your comments, Michelle. There is so little left, and I think we need to be restoring it, not just trying to fight for these tiny little pockets of remaining habitat.
And that's one thing I think the ACT, it's not just about restoring it, is one thing the ACT can and should be doing and investing money into be doing. And, it's a small project, but one that I'm excited about is the Sullivan's Creek renaturalisation. So that's a creek that's really a drain that runs through the centre of the inner north and the centre of the city. And we have the ability here, the government is proposing to renaturalise that, and that could play a really important role in bringing back nature into our city. And that's a small project, but there's lots of opportunities here to be thinking not just about stopping the destruction, but how we restore and regenerate and do it within a way that connects people to nature. And I think that could be quite valuable. Do we have any other questions, comments, or are people ready, happy and feel like you've got a lot of information tonight? Well, I reckon I've seen no more hands and no more comments in the chat. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Erin for taking time on an evening to come and talk to us about this, particularly after the depressing week that was last week. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending and asking great questions. We really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this. We'll send out an email within a day or two that will include the recording of the event as well as the slides. So you can have a look at this and you can watch back if you'd like. I'd have to get my work to just edit it a little bit so we can cut out the chat at the start that we had. But thank you all very much for attending, and there'll be more information. This webinar series will be one that Conservation Council is going to be running quarterly from here on in. And so we'll have another one probably in March next year, and there'll be information about that coming out soon in our newsletter. So please keep an eye out. There'll be ones on really interesting topics coming forward. So thank you all again, and have a great evening.
Thank you.